morning, everybody, and thank you very much for your kind invitation. It's good to be here. The last time I was at a gathering like this was probably 30 years ago, and Arthur was in charge. And he's still here. So I've been involved in risk management since the mid-1980s, and I was very, very young when I started. It's just like Catherine, I guess. Anything you've done for 30 years, you must have been young when you started, right? But I'm still involved in risk management because two reasons. It works. It actually helps us be more successful. And the second reason is it's still developing and we're still learning new things about different types of risks and the best ways to manage them. But I remember back to the very first time I was asked to do a risk assessment. In the mid-1980s, I was working for Ferranti down in Portsmouth, involved in command systems for the Navy. And I was asked to introduce risk management to the company, which was just before it went bust. So that was good. I did tell them, and I jumped out just in time. But the very first risk assessment I did and created a risk database using DBase 3, which Galareth might like to have a look at. That still works. I wrote a report, and we identified some risks, and we prioritised them, red, yellow, and green, and so on. I wrote this nice little report, top risks and responses and all of that, gave it to the project manager, who gave it to the project sponsor, and they said, very interesting, so how risky is the project? And I went, well, we've got about 35 risks, and 7 of them are red, and there's 10 of them are yellow, and the rest are green. And so there's your risk report. And he said, yeah, I can see that, but how risky is the project? And is it okay? And I went, I don't know, I'll get back to you. And it took me something like 15 years to work out how to answer the question. It's a really important question, because most people, when they do risk management, they do the risk identification and assessment, and they produce a risk register, they file it. They may or may not do something as well. So, risk analysis needs to turn into risk management, doing something about it. But we're all focused on individual threats and if we're really up to speed, individual opportunities. But in terms of answering that bigger key question, is this okay? How risky is the project? A lot of us are not really quite sure how to do that. And so we have really two key questions. How risky is the project? And the follow-on, obviously, and what are you going to do about it once you know how risky it is? And we'll come to that later on. And I think it's really important that we are able to answer that bigger question rather than just focusing on all the little bits and pieces of detail. I've been involved in both the APM, in the risk management SIG. I was one of the early chairmen, author of the PRAM guide, if you remember that thing. And also involved in PMI in their risk management, the Project Management Institute, in their risk management sort of function, and wrote the risk chapter of the PMBOK guide, which Americans find have a joke in it in the contents list, because it turns out that risk management is chapter 11, which for Americans is very funny, but we don't get it, do we? All right, never mind. Chapter 11, bankruptcy code, risk management. All right. I'll have to have a little flag that says, this is a joke, laugh now, right? Anyway, about the year 2004 or 5, we developed this idea that we need to answer the question, how risky is the project? And there are two ways of answering the question, two levels of both the question and two levels of answer. For project managers, we are interested in the risks that are in the project. And these are these individual risks which we record in the risk register and which we describe in our risk reports. But there's another question that the project sponsor wants to know, or the owner or the customer, and how risky is the overall project? Not just what are the risks in the project, but what is the risk of the project? Is this a high-risk project, a medium risk, a low risk? Is it acceptable or not? And so there's a difference between the risks in the project and the risk of the project. And for the portfolio manager or the customer, they're not so interested in the detail of the individual risks. They're more interested in knowing how risky the project is as a whole. And so we developed this concept, something like 15 years ago, of two different levels of risk, individual risks and overall risk. And if you look in both the PRAM guide and the PMBOK guide, and these are the most recent sort of definitions, the most recent versions, there are two levels of definition. So in the PMBOK guide, a risk is defined as this: uncertain event or condition, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on project objectives. So we've got opportunities and threats, positive effects or negative effects. And APM in the latest version of the PRAM guide, which is quite old, and this is where this idea first arose, and also in the most recent body of knowledge for the Association for Project Management, same thing: uncertain event or circumstances, if it occurs, affects objectives. But there's a second level of concept, which is the overall project risk, which PMI defines as this: the effect of uncertainty on the project as a whole, more than just the sum of the individual risks. So there's synergies and there's influences, there's dependencies between risks, they're correlated. One risk might make another worse or better, or it might make another impossible or make it happen. So we've got that sort of bigger picture, and there are, of course, other sources of uncertainty, not just individual risks. And we find that in the APM guide. Overall risk is the exposure of stakeholders to the consequences of variation in outcome. So you might have all these little bits and pieces going on within the project, but the key thing is how risky is the overall project? What's the possible variation in the final project outcome or outturn? And it arises from individual risks and other sources of uncertainty. And so now our question is, if we've got these two things, individual risks are specific events that we deal with in day-to-day risk management, but overall project risk is a whole project concept. It includes all sources of uncertainty, and it's not just about day-to-day risk management. Once you know how risky the overall project is, then it helps you both in your strategic positioning of the project. It helps you in the way you manage your program and portfolio to keep risk efficiency or a risk-balanced portfolio. And it helps you, it's really important, in overall project governance, in the way that we resource the project, in the priorities that we give to it, in the way that we impose monitoring or control on a project, will be driven by how risky the overall project is. And so there are implications here. The key question for us at the project level, where quite a lot of us work, is this anything to do with us? Are we bothered about the overall project, or do we just have to deliver within scope and time and budget? Or is this something we need to know about? And I think as project managers, we are responsible for managing individual risks, but also accountable for delivering the project within its overall risk exposure. So we have two levels. We have responsibility as part of the project management task for managing the individual risks in the project, but our sponsor or our customer or our project owner is going to hold us accountable for how risky the overall project is. So we need to be able to manage both of these things. And the key question is, how do we do that? And here we come back to the two questions in my sort of title. So how risky is the project? How do you know how risky it is? And once you know how risky the overall project is, what are you going to do about that? Of course, we have a process for managing individual risks. What do we do for managing overall risk? And most projects only concentrate on managing individual risks through the traditional risk management process. And I call that explicit risk management. We have a process, we have a risk register, we have reports. It's all written down. We know exactly how we're going to do this. It's all out in the open. This is risk management. But we also have another level of risk management, which I call implicit risk management. It's hidden. The overall project risk is assessed during project initiation through our scoping decisions. And the way that we actually scope the project in terms of its content and its context, in terms of where the boundaries are and what's in and what's not in the project, sets the overall level of riskiness for the whole project. And so we've got these two levels of risk, implicit and explicit. Implicit risk management is created through our decisions about the structure and scope, content and context of the whole project. And this is overall project riskiness. And then explicit risk management is our standard process that we use to identify, analyse, plan responses and implement them and monitor and control and review. And this is focused on individual risks. If you look in your standard risk management process, it only focuses on managing individual threats and maybe individual opportunities. And traditionally or currently or common practice, maybe not best practice, is that this side, decisions about the overall riskiness of the project, These sort of things are only thought about during project initiation, when we set the project up. Once we define the project and we press the big green button and we go, then that's all set in concrete, and now we're left with managing individual risks. And this we kind of forget about. We never look again at how overall risky the project is in current practice. Now, maybe some of you, so you're looking at me a bit odd, you might be thinking, do you know what, we've been doing this for years. If you have, you're not in the majority. Most people, risk management is this, and they only think about that if they think about it at all at the beginning of the project. Is that a good idea? I don't think so. I think we need to be aware, as people who are working in projects, of the overall riskiness of the whole project throughout the lifetime of the project, because we are accountable to our project sponsor, program manager, business owner, customer, for how risky the project is that we're trying to deliver for them, so that we deliver it within an acceptable level of risk. So I think we need to know how to manage overall project risk during execution as well as during initiation. It's not enough just to think about how risky the project is before we launch it, then we launch it, and then we just kind of cope with the things that happen along the way. We need to be having both that detailed view and the higher level view of our project that says, yes, of course we're managing the individual things that are coming up from day to day, but how is that affecting the overall project? Is it still lying within the risk threshold or the risk appetite set for it by our project owner, project sponsor, or customer? And so it's really important that we have some view of how to do that, and that will involve identification, quantifying, responding, and monitoring, but of something a little bit different. We're not identifying individual risks. We're looking at the things that drive the overall riskiness of the project. And we're not going to do any kind of quantitative assessment because there is one level of risk exposure that the project carries. We want to quantify it, but it's not a question of ranking or prioritizing or plotting on a matrix or anything. What we do want to know how risky the project is, and we need some way of quantifying that. Once we know that, we've got to do something about it. And once we've done something about it, we need to see if it was working and how things are changing as a result of our actions. So I think it's possible for us to have, just to go back, a structured way of thinking about overall project riskiness or overall project risk during the execution of the project. And it's something that, as project professionals, we need to have front and center in our minds, as well as the detailed management of the projects as we go through. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes quickly looking at each of these four things. How do we understand and quantify overall project risk, and then how do we respond to it? What do we do about it, and how do we report it? And hopefully you'll begin to see that if this isn't something you've done regularly in your projects or in the things that you're working with and the project teams that you're supporting, it's actually not that difficult. And you probably already have the tools and skills available at your disposal to do most of these things. It's just a question of changing our thinking and thinking at that higher level about overall risk as well as individual risks. So if we think about identification, we're not going to be identifying the overall riskiness of the project. That comes in the quantification step. What we are identifying is the things that lead the project to be risky. So the identification step in the overall risk management process is not identifying risks, it's identifying things that lead to risk. And risk, as we know, is uncertainty that affects objectives, or as we saw in those earlier definitions, the effect of uncertainty on the project as a whole. So we're looking for sources. What are the things that give the whole project, that make the whole project risky? Overall project is just one thing. Overall project risk is one thing. There is a level of risk exposure associated with the project at this moment in time, but it comes from a number of different sources. And fortunately, there are a number of well-established frameworks that we can use to help us find these sources. And some of these you might be familiar with. PESTLE is the original political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental, yes? Or the other version that was PESLEAD, where we add in demographic and either information or international Of course, there's steeple, which is the same as pestle, but it's got ethical. Are you familiar with all of these? There's loads of them. I've got this: innovation, social, political, economic, cultural, and cultural and technology. Spectrum. I mean, honestly, they go on and on. TCOP is one that was developed by Shell: technical, economic, commercial, operational, and political. And then, of course, VUCA that everybody's familiar with: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. You got all of those? You knew all that, didn't you? Yes, David?
Is there a test at the end?
Yes, that's right, yes. If you're no good at crosswords, you don't stand a chance. So one of these would do, any one of them. Basically, it's just a prompt list, isn't it? It's a way of saying, here are some categories to think about. But we're thinking about how do these different things, and these are whole project things. When you think about political or economic or environmental, you're not really, you could, of course, but you're not really thinking about the individual risks on the project. You're thinking about the context and the content and the scope and structure of the project, that we had under the category of implicit risk management. So various frameworks, and you can use any one of them. The idea is just to think more broadly. What could make this project risky in addition to the individual risks that I've identified? Okay? And then we use these things as a prompt list in our risk identification. Maybe we have a brainstorm where we have some interviews, or we do some kind of SWOT analysis or something, standard risk identification techniques, but at a higher level. So we're not focusing on the individual things, the individual sources of uncertainty. We're looking at the big picture uncertainties for the whole project. Once we've got those, then we have to ask the question, well, what do they do to the project? A qualitative assessment isn't relevant in the sense that we've only got one thing, we're not prioritizing anything, we're just trying to see how big it is, but we do still have two dimensions to think about in overall project risk, which are the same as the two dimensions of individual risk. We might call it uncertainty that matters or uncertainty that has an effect on objectives. But at the whole project level, the uncertainty is how uncertain is this project in its likelihood to succeed? What is the probability of success, or in the inverse of that, the probability of failure? That is our overall measure of uncertainty, of the overall riskiness of the whole project. What's the probability of success or a failure? In terms of the effect, so uncertainty that can affect objectives, thinking at the whole project level, what is that overall level of uncertainty likely to do to the overall project outcome? And so we're looking at variation on project objectives, which could be positive and negative in the same way that individual risks are threats or opportunities. Then overall project risk introduces the possibility of beating our objectives or of not meeting them. So we've got positive and negative levels of variation. Now you're beginning to see, I hope, that we're reaching towards something that you're a little bit more familiar with. We're just doing it at a different level. There's only one value of uncertainty and potential variation for the whole project at any one point in time. But what we need to know is, what is it? So it's not like we're saying, there's lots of different overall project riskinesses. There's only one. There's one level of uncertainty. At any point in time, your project has a particular probability of success. And at any point in time, given the uncertainties that could affect it, there's a range of variation on how the project could turn out. So we're not doing qualitative assessment, no such thing as a PI matrix. You'd only just have one spot on it, in it, although, of course, you could monitor what these overall values were with time, and we'll come back to that when we think about reporting. What is more interesting is quantification. How uncertain is the project? What is the probability of success or failure? And how much potential variation is there in the potential outcome, in the project outcome, against its objectives? And now you know what the answer is. We're looking for the effect of uncertainty on the project as a whole, or the exposure of our stakeholders to variation in outcome. And these are questions with quantitative, with numerical answers. How likely is the project to succeed? What is the potential range of variation? And the tool that we have at our fingertips to do this is standard Monte Carlo simulation. which you, I hope, will be familiar with as one of those tools that you just have up your sleeves and you say, oh yeah, I know about that. But what we're doing is using this not just to look at the key risk drivers, not just to look at the overall level of contingency that you might want to build in, but looking at the overall riskiness of the project, uncertainty and effect, by answering these questions quantitatively so that we can say how risky the project is now, track it over time and see if it's going in the right direction, and then shape overall project responses to the overall level of project risk exposure. So if we know where we are now and how we got here, and if we don't do anything where we're going to end up, we need to do something about it. The second question, what are you going to do about it, once you know the answer to these questions? And that's going to be driven by how risky the project is now. And our responses are going to be at whole project level. Okay? So here is, you can all smile at this point. Yeah, we know how to do this. A standard S-curve. I'm sorry it's got dollars, but there we are. Here's one I prepared earlier. You've got the baseline spend, the planned value, or the what do we used to call it? The estimated cost of work performed. Is that it or something? Anyway, that one. This is how we expect to spend our money over time, and you could do the same for time and so on. And maybe we've got a project that has a target of 2.2 million, and the chance of meeting that is about 1 in 4. We can look at the range of variation. Perhaps we take the 5 and 95% percentiles. You might take the 1090 or 2080. It depends on your risk appetite. And we can see that the variation between those levels is about 500,000. So the 5% point here is 2.1, and the 95% point up there is about 2.6. So we've got 500,000 variation in the overall project. We're now beginning to answer the two questions. What is the probability of us meeting the targets? How much uncertainty is there in the project? Our current probability of success is 23%, roughly. And how much variation is there, a potential variation in the outcome at this point in time? It's 500,000. Okay? And if we wanted, we could also work out where we think we're going to be, our expected value, which isn't the 50th percentile because it depends on the shape of the curve. I'm sure you know that. And if we wanted to say that we were going to set a more realistic target, where would that have to be to give us a good chance of succeeding and some other higher probability of success? And that might need to be somewhere up here. Now we're beginning to answer our questions of overall project riskiness in quantified terms. So the first question, which is the uncertainty dimension, how likely is the project to succeed? We've got a 23% chance of hitting our target, and our expected value is 7% above the target. We're quantifying the amount of uncertainty in the project. And in terms of the exposure of our stakeholders to potential variation in outcomes, we've quantified that too. We've got a potential range in the 5 to 95% percentiles of 500,000, which is over a fifth of the project value. Our realistic best case is 4% under the target, and our realistic worst case is nearly 20% over. Now we can answer the question, is this okay? Now you could take that, and you wouldn't take it in this form. We'd obviously have to find a better way of presenting it to our project sponsors and customers and so on. But we've got the data to answer the question, what is the overall riskiness of the project? At this point in time, we've got a 1 in 4 chance of succeeding. We think we're going to overspend by about 5 to 10%. There's a possibility we could, of course, be about 5% over, but we could be under, but we could be 20% over. We're answering the question, how risky is the project, in real measurable terms. Okay? And this is a quantification of overall project risk. Now, there's lots of other questions behind that I don't have a lot of time to go into, but the other questions will be, so how do you build the model and how do you make sure it reflects all the other sources of uncertainty and so on. But that's just technique, isn't it? And we know how to do that, don't we? Don't we? So the next question which follows, once we have the answer, how risky is the project, and it's quantified in the two key dimensions of uncertainty and effect, or variation, a probability of success and variation on our objectives. And this example was cost, but we could have done time or resource level or return on investment or net present value or anything that varies we can model, right? The next question is, what are we going to do about it? We need to make risk-based decisions on the overall project. Not how am I going to manage the individual risks. What am I going to do about the project as a whole? And the response options that we have at the whole project level are similar to what we could do for individual risks. You'll have an avoidance response. We could just take out the most risky parts of the project, or we could always cancel the project. It is a possibility in lots of cases. Or we could exploit if we're planning to be under budget or early. Maybe we put in some more elements to the project. Maybe we increase the level of testing. Maybe we go for an early release or we go for an interim release. We can take advantage of forecast underspends if we have them. Transfer or share involving other parties in management of the risk. Standard things for the whole project, joint ventures, special purpose vehicles, merging or selling the project. And we can either reduce the probability and impact of negative overall riskiness or enhance the probability and impact of positive overall project riskiness, shifting the curve to the left and making it more upright so there's less variation. Or we could just say, this is fine. Let's just carry on. But the point is, although these are familiar options, we're doing this at the level of the whole project. We're not worrying at this stage about the individual risks. That happens through standard risk management. But for the project sponsor or the business owner, or maybe your portfolio manager, you've got other levels of decision to make about the whole project. And it helps to have these structured response options like we have for individual risks. It helps you to focus your thinking, but you're thinking about the overall project. How do I reduce the overall project risk exposure? Or how do I exploit this good potential project outcome, which is predicted? What can I do about it? And then, of course, we have to tell people what we found. And we wouldn't tell people in the level of detail of the analysis itself. You know, one of the key responsibilities of a risk person or of a specialist analyst is to communicate in the language of your user. So you're speaking the language that they understand. So we need to update our assessments of overall project risk and tell stakeholders how risky is the project, what's driving it, what are we doing, and where is it leading us, and what do we think is going to be the progress that we predict at our next reporting point. And then monitor whether those changes are in existence, whether they're actually happening as we predicted, standard stuff. The only problem is we don't have any common practice dashboard elements or formats for reporting overall project risk. That hasn't yet sort of found its way, as far as I can see, into the toolkit. So I'd like to suggest one potential component for the dashboard. There are other things that I've thought of that we could include, but here's something quite simple, which I call the overall project risk barometer. And so what we're saying is there's a zone of overall risk exposure which is unacceptable. There's a zone which needs some sort of monitoring. We need to be careful, and there's an OK zone. And what we can do is think about the probability of success as setting thresholds on our overall parameters, or on our overall barometer. And these levels you might choose to vary depending on the risk appetite for the project. And then what we can do is determine or plot the probability of overall project success at different review points. And so what we might see is here's our 23% point earlier on. Oh dear, we're not happy with that. We want to see something better. And so over time, we can see how things vary, and hopefully it's going to do something like that. And if this is time now, we can draw a trend line and say, well, you know, by the time we get to the end of the project, things should be okay. Or not. And this will determine what we do in terms of our activity, our responses at the level of the overall project. This is just the one dimension, the uncertainty dimension. What's the probability of success? It doesn't tell you anything about variability, but we could plot that as well. What we could actually say is, here we've got our target level for the particular objective. It could be a budget, or it could be a milestone, or a project delivery date, or a return on investment, or anything. And then we can say the good thing is to be under target. The bad thing is to be over target, and we can put on some kind of variation based on the S-curve. So here we've got our 5% point and our 95% point, or 10 and 90, or whatever you choose, and your expected value. And that gives you, along with a 23% chance of success, we can see that our expected value is somewhere over target, oh dear. In fact, the whole curve is the wrong side. You might have recognised that, or you might not. And then we can plot how that goes with time, and we can do some kind of trend analysis and say, well, hopefully everything will be fine, or not. Now, this kind of simple visualization might help us to just report what we're finding, not at the level of individual risks, not we've got 7 red ones and 15 yellow ones and 30 green ones, which is important, but it doesn't help answer the bigger question. But this sort of visualization just might help us report in a way that people understand. Well, I am nearly out of time, so let me just give a few final thoughts. What do we need to do if we want to put this into practice? We need to recognise that risk is important. It featured in Catherine's presentation in a couple of places, about risk-based decisions and risk-based resourcing and so on. Risk is important, and individual risks, of course, are important, but so is the level of overall project riskiness. We need to understand it, and we need to do something about it proactively. We need to manage not just the individual risks, but the level of overall project riskiness. And that means we need to evolve our best practice to cover this level of whole project perspective as well. It's been in the professional guidelines for about 15 years, the PRAM guide in 2004, but the standards need to provide guidance in how to do that. We need to have it included in our training courses, in our presentations, in our procedures and processes. We need people to know how to do this level of overall risk assessment. We need to deal equally with the risks in the project, the individual risks, and the riskiness of the project. Both of them are important, and both of them need to be managed. So when coming to the question time, usually you ask me questions. I'm going to ask you some questions first, and here are my questions. This is the test. So what does PESLEAD stand for? Here's the question. How risky is your project and what are you doing about it? Obviously. But the question is, can you answer the question? That's the real question. Do you know the answer? Are you including this concept of overall project riskiness in your thinking and practice? And if not, why not? How would you do that? And what changes do you need in your thinking and your practice, both your approach and your understanding of risk, but also in your procedures, your tools and your techniques and your training? So I hope you found that interesting and slightly bigger perspective than most of us take on risk management at the moment. That's all I've got. And the other questions are for you. So thank you very much. Thank you.